MLOps, particularly around scalability and cost effectiveness, and how you can deploy that within the Domino platform, although I'll keep it kind of broad across uh, kind of general needs as well. My name's Vawdrey. For those of you who I have not met before, I am Field Chief Data Scientist at Domino. I spend a lot of my time out working with customers on actually implementing solutions within the platform. And then, we put it into a PowerPoint presentation. We go back to the executives and say, look, we can, on this holdout test set, we can go ahead and save this amount of money. It'll drive this amount of revenue. Everyone usually is super excited about that, but that's really where the work starts, right? It's about getting it actually deployed out into a business function or into an application in front of users, monitoring that, getting the feedback loop going, making sure it's governed. We'll talk about the importance of that, and maintaining it as actual software is where you get the true value from these data science models. I see a few folks nodding. Are you kind of in this, seeing the same thing? Okay. So why am I seeing why AI projects fail? And there's quite a long list here, but um, the first thing is what I just mentioned, focused around data science and not focused around how we actually going to get this into production and what is the ROI and how are we going to measure that? Like, what are the KPIs, right? A lot of times folks are just building, again, data science models, and it's not clear about what is that metric or number that I'm actually trying to move. The second thing is the old, hey, I'm a data scientist. I'm going to go away and build this thing. And I come back and it's like black magic. It works. That process is broken, right? It's really important to have good collaboration between the business folks or the sponsors or the users, but also within the team itself. The path to prod, again, we're going to be talking about MLOps here, but that's very important. And a lot of times folks are building models without understanding what is that path to prod. And a lot of times the decisions around what algorithm you use, is this batch or streaming, for instance, what data can I actually use in this system, right? Sometimes I might have some data to build a static one-time model off, but I have it in production to update that model. All these decisions need to be made based on the larger ecosystem and actually deploying that. The final challenge I've kind of called out here is really this kind of once and done, right? Is not thinking about the feedback loop once I actually get it out in front of users. Is it doing what I think it's doing? Can I improve on it? Is it driving those KPIs? Um, is anyone seeing any other major challenges out there that they'd like to call out? Quiet room, no worries. While in the ocean, what is the challenge there that you see when people are doing that? Just nothing gets done, or
And expecting that the bill was return. Didn't not did the PU pay of not there, but the return that fine.
and what drives that? Is that like an external factor of people asking for too much, or is that the data scientists taking on too much? Or
All blob it rep without the right, and then blob it rep without the right, and then the entire people have to do.
all right. And we don't know each other, so when these slides come up later, I didn't pay him to tee him up to tee this up here. So
I see, in my opinion, I did there are three more factors. Is the maturity of the processes in the model, and the second one is the availability of the ecosystem that support radio theory.
to talk to a little bit about that first one around the maturity. So is that a technology and a team?
Maturity around maybe technology. We are still evolving, we are still learning, and we'll be able to be getting that confidence to have the custom in and provide production level or 99.999%.
Oh, I got, Oh,
Yeah. I mean, probably I get it. Right, people problem with the
yeah. I think we're all kind of hearing the same things here. So hopefully this will we'll get some conversation and start getting to some solutions. Yeah. So again, kind of bridging the gap is what I think around ML ops. So a lot of work around this ML innovation down the bottom. Building a novel architecture, building a really great model, trying the latest greatest Python package or so forth, or Gen AI is the big thing, right? How can I tie OpenAI or some LLM within my system? But again, without understanding what the business impact is, none of that really matters, right? And I think speaking to your point is getting these models actually out into making a business impact, whether it's getting it in front of users within an application on an iPhone or web browser, or even if it's just driving another service or system within a business, back a point of sale system or whatever that is. I think driving towards that from the start is really important. And so what MLOps is meant to help you automate and get this process going faster, but without that initial piece, you're building for the sake of building, right? So for those who are not familiar with MLOps, which I'm guessing everyone in this room is, it's really a framework designed to help you deploy, manage, govern, monitor these models out in production. Um, Traditionally, what would happen is data scientists would do all the work, and then you would hand it off to an engineering team to do the deployment. The promise of MLOps is that the data scientists can do more of that work. I don't think we've met that promise in terms of not being able to hand it off. I think it's still important to do that handoff. However, MLOps frameworks can make that process a lot easier. So there's kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. I think about when an MLOps, right, is really around this automation, enabling data scientists to be able to get code and run it out on an actual server, right? So it's not running on your laptop, both for scale reasons, but then also so it can run overnight. Other people can get access to it, all those value adds. Then there's the whole data piece, right? Big data used to be the term when I started being a data scientist 15 years ago, but that's kind of just assumed now. But there's a lot of kind of that data management, being able to run and orchestrate jobs and tasks, being able to query that data easily and being able to visualize it. This is crucial here, and garbage in, garbage out, right? So this is very, very important. Um, the next is around the automation piece, and this is where MLOps really starts to come into play around how do you actually get these models out and things like feature stores, which are another hot topic we could do a whole another meeting about, but the model serving component, experiments tracking, drift detection, all those pieces that you need in order to kind of get that feedback loop, measure, monitor it out in production. Finally, again, this is the most important part we're going to come back to a lot is actually framing a problem that is going to drive business value, understanding what those KPIs are, and then user adoption. How are people actually going to use this model once it's deployed? I think this is a very challenging piece that we often kind of skip over. And so really focusing on that upfront, and not every problem needs a Gen AI model. Not every problem needs some sophisticated things. Sometimes just a case statement might be an initial starting point that you start iterating on and driving towards a solution that becomes more complex over time. And so I have a, example. There's a few customers I'm actually talking to now at Domino. Our professional services team does a lot of work with working with executives and across different teams to identify what are the business problems, what is the data availability, what is the path to prod, all these pieces that we've been talking to. And we pretty much just get that information and work with a team to plot that based on a 2x2 level of effort and business value to get the low hanging fruit. Um, So we kind of do this exercise a lot, and it's very surprising how many folks are still doing data science for data science sake, which is you actually ask a data scientist, why are you building this model? And they say, well, I don't know, right? Like, I do not understand the business impact of what I'm building here. I'm just told to get a churn rate of X or um, AUC above zero point 0.8 or whatever that metric is. So I think it's crucial that your teams actually understand what they're building and why they're building it. And so, starting to think about this process of how you build is really starting off with that envision. And we want to keep drilling into that there, but very crucial. Then the build, deploy, and the monitor. These are the pieces where MLOps really comes into play. So again, we're trying to solve that handoff problem. However, a lot of the hooks into these platforms and frameworks actually start at the model development stage. So as you're kind of designing and going through this process, again, you want to think about the end to end and think about, all right, if I was to deploy this, how am I going to go about that? And so within Domino's, those of you that are using Domino, we use ML flows. So we'll hook in the experiments, tracking, and so forth as we're building. And so that makes it easy to deploy. Other tools are very similar. But the idea there is to get away from this research project where I've got hundreds of pieces of code. I don't know what version worked, what didn't. So coming up with a strategic plan about how you're actually going to run this R&D build phase. Um, Once you get into the deploy, we're going to talk a little bit about scalability and cost savings here. So that's the next thing to think about, and then we'll do monitoring. So sorry, I feel like we keep coming back to this ROI, but it's really crucial. So this is an example here of how I would with a previous client who's kind of approved this for us is how you go about actually determining what are the KPIs that I know you'll be targeting. And then this trickles down to everything from what are the size of the instances, the hardware I need to train, how much data should I use, what type of model, right? And so in this case, what they're trying to do is automate their compliance and regulatory process. Um, Gen AI was used in this case, but they came up with some metrics around how much is a compliance officer per year multiplied by their team, how much time they're actually spending on this task of compliance, which was actually sucking up all of their time, and then what was the average kind of violation cost. Then what we did is we helped them come up with what is it actually going to cost to implement this, and this is thinking about just this single use case, but you can imagine the software license infrastructure costs can get distributed out across multiple projects there. It's kind of one time. But coming up with what is the cost to actually run this for the first year, and then after that, and then thinking about, all right, what are the savings here that we can drive? And so, in this case, after the first year, it came down to about 50%. So it made sense for them to move forward. But now we also have some guardrails around, all right, as we're building, can we build it for this amount of money? Because if we go over that, right, it's not going to make sense anymore. So some of the things to keep in mind around auto scaling. So the ability to turn off servers at night when they're not in use, right? So a lot of these systems, and this one in particular, we used a lot of queues. So as data was coming in, it would spin up the underlying container and infrastructure there. This gave them depending on whether we're in the load workflow phase or in the actual inference using it, was 30 to 45%. The monitoring and tracing is very, very important to think about upfront. As you're building these systems, they get complex very quick. And so being able to identify where an error is, what happened at what time, just makes it so much easier to jump on that and be able to fix it. The FinOps, right? So you're using these cloud infrastructure, also within Domino, we have the ability to get very fine grain, how much is each individual instance costing, right? And then that drives the scale up and scale down components. Being able to identify issues in the system earlier kind of tracks back to the monitoring and tracing, but also the KPIs that you're looking at, right? So why are we not identifying the um, compliance violations that we were planning to, or that we did manually, right? Might be a benchmark that we would look against there. And then finally, the resource efficiency. So around scheduling, how often do we retrain the model, right? And so I'll kind of give this example here. We're talking to a casino. For those of you who gamble, you might have been to this one before, but I heard this for the first time and I was like, I can't believe people are doing this. And I spoke to my colleague, um, Dylan, and he's like, oh, I actually see this come up all the time. I was like, no way. But then now I've started looking out for it. It happens all the time. So customer builds a set of models. They work really well. They don't think through the retraining process. So every night they just retrain the model. So not only are you potentially having an accuracy issue, right? There's like some statistical significance potentially that you're need to be looking at there, and you're basically creating a lot of volatility in the predictions, the tracing, and so forth. They're using terabytes and terabytes of data running through a data processing pipeline that we calculated was costing about $250,000 a year to run this model every night. And so another thing kind of in terms of cost effectiveness is to really think about when you deploy, how often do you need to train this model? It might be fine to do that for a while, right? And pick up, do I need to do this or not? But, you know, thinking through, right, how often do I need to train this, both from a mathematical standpoint, but also from a cost, right? Because we want to, a lot of people are nodding here. Is this, you've seen this before? Okay. Blows my mind a little bit. I Let's seem to think about these things, but you can imagine this was one model, it's 200 plus K. You have 100 models running, you're talking about millions of bucks in compute that is just getting thrown out the window. So, okay, so we talked a little bit about the cost piece, getting to the scalability, um, modularizing up this, right, and getting your workflows split up into containers is very important. Within Domino, what I do is I think about the end-to-end pipeline, and then I start modularizing things up in actual projects. And what this allows you to do is scale those and then also spin them up and down as required. We also have the pipeline automation through the jobs, but also those of you on the newer version of Domino will know about flows, which is kind of the next step up there in terms of being able to manage a full system. And I know Dan in the back's an expert at that if you have any questions. And then finally, the monitoring piece. So as an example, we were building a RAG system, and this was a really great example. We are doing PDF parsing that has a OCR component. Those of you who passed huge amounts of PDFs before know that some PDFs are corrupt, some have password protection, some have all these nuances. So you actually need to pre-process the data, get it into a point, and then the goal with RAG, or at least the system we're generating, was to create Markdown. That process took a little under, yeah, it was roughly 30 seconds, depending on the size of the document. So if we'd done that as a single node, um, through all the docs that they had, it was going to take almost a year to run. Um, Interesting. This is kind of high risk too, because the next step is you do chunking and embedding. And chunking and embedding, for those of you who've done this, there's a million different ways you can do that. So as you're running this pipeline, right, if you were to do this all together, you could blow a huge amount of cost. But so passing this, making sure it's done right, starting with that experiment, scaling it out. But if we go to 10 nodes, 35 days, 100 nodes, 3 days. So this talks to why you want to have that horizontal scale out around that component, then the chunking and embedding. In this particular scenario, we found that 3 embedding servers to every 10 PDF passes was the right mix. So again, kind of driving that cost effectiveness. I see some folks nodding their heads over there. Are you using this kind of layout currently in your architectures, or? He's on his phone now, or maybe sleeping. Sorry. I got your slide up. Did you want to present it? So yeah, okay. So we're getting started, right? I think the comments earlier about spot on, right? There's high demand, especially now AI's hit the mainstream, from executives to push AI initiatives. Um, these things are not easy. There's lots of tools coming out, packages all the time. If you're just chasing, you can end up being like dog chasing a car, right? And so the other thing is if you try and build these massive platforms, all this sophisticated at each layer, you also end up getting nothing done, right? So coming back to the business value piece and how I think about it is you always want to be pushing to do a thin slice through the stack, which is starting off with the application. How is this actually going to get served? Then going through the MLOps component, how we're actually going to get the data or the model up into the app, the model itself, the data, and the platform, right? Get this whole thin slice done, and then get a quick win. Stress the system of these different levels, and then start building out from there. And you have a champion then to show, hey, this might have not been 90% accurate that you want, but at 75% accurate, we've made this amount of money. And if we push it up another 5%, it will do this. And this allows you to start kind of getting away from that boil the ocean problem. Is there any other approaches folks are using to get around that boil the ocean? Or see a lot of nodding here. Is this kind of standard or everyone's boiling the ocean?
Model actually says it says your E is cut so when is the start MLOps app and you viable. They're very deep the knowledgeable sir. Yeah. And to
Yeah. What kind of modeling work are you doing? Okay. Yeah, I think what I'm hearing you saying is if there's some models that have a higher risk of is this even possible or not, then it might not make sense to do the rest of these. I would say that those would not be the good models to chase as your first thin slice to build a champion model. Um, you get into a whole, we can have a whole nother discussion about this, but you get into a situation where you're doing high risk models where if a team starts building an app, they might be building an app for the no hot, right? And so I think that's would be what I would steer clear of those initially. Data science field is pretty mature, and you can go out and find where your low hanging fruit are. However, that's an interesting scenario. We should circle back on that. I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't have a good solution there. The other thing I noticed a lot is it's not all about the data scientists, but ML ops. We kind of had this promise of we wouldn't need an ML engineer. And I think there's probably some people in this room and folks they can hire that can do everything. However, realistically, in large organizations, each individual system becomes so complex that it's too much to kind of take on as a single person. And so, even though we have these MLOps frameworks, having these individuals within the process here is important, starting with the business stakeholder with the domain expertise, the requirements, um, someone who owns the subject matter expertise around the data scientist building the models, the ML engineer that will be productionalizing it. So taking what comes out of ML flow, which, is typically a thin slice, so getting you started and actually taking that and deploying it into the larger system, using that initial deployment from the ML ops as an accelerator, and then you're getting the infrastructure and so forth aligned with it. Much time. Okay, cool. As you're guys deciding on the platform, I think there's a lot of tools that kind of come in the midst and packages here. So flexibility is really important. Every week I read a new paper about this tool does this better now, and I don't think you want that as a constraint. At Domino, we really try to have an open platform that you can include as many of these tools on, but as you're kind of going down this, so you don't want to be constrained by the software. That being said, you also don't want a complete mess out there where there's no standards. So I think you want to try and come up with hey, this is our opinionated stack and tools to go to. However, if those tools aren't getting the job done, then this is a way to bring something else in. And then the last piece here is around governance. And so This is another interesting piece here, and there's kind of two ways to think about governance I've come across. Is one is in the idea of regulatory, legal, organizational, mitigating risk, making sure that your models aren't biased, they're not illegal, not unethical, those type of things. The second thing that's been interesting that's coming up is teams tend to be happier if you're enforcing standards, right? And we came across a customer recently that said, "Hey, the data scientist tell me I went back to work on a project that was done 2 years ago, and the person hadn't followed any of the process with documenting the code, documenting what it was, and it took them weeks to get up and running. Whereas they go to another data scientist work that was done years ago, and everything was documented out. It was in a process that they could follow. And so one interesting thing that we're finding around governance is, yeah, it's not just about the regulatory piece, having these gates in place that say, hey, make sure that you describe what you're doing, what are the KPIs, how is this plan to be used, makes the teams happier. I'm running out of time here, so talk about reusability as your teams are working through. Another kind of accelerator thing that we're seeing successful teams use is by pulling out shared functionality out of their process. So this is not at the platform layer in terms of, containerization or so forth. This is actually in the code, right? Am I using this particular feature engineering or data processing code and multiple departments are using that? Extracting that out and creating a shared capability is a great accelerator. And we've started to do that. Dan in the back here is talking to a customer currently who's doing some of that work in a what we call a Domino template. One of the things that came up as I was building this is AI ops versus MLOps, and I don't think I'm the person to market and determine what's what there. However, Gen AI is pushing the kind of boundaries and requirements around MLOps in a really good way. So things like tracing that you see in agentic systems is actually really helpful for just standard traditional ML workflows as well. So it's whether it's labeled the same way or not, it's pushing the MLOps platforms to be better and pushing the outer limits there. So Gen AI tends to be much harder to get into an application. It's, regular machine learnings can be non-deterministic, but definitely LLMs can spit out some really random stuff, which makes it hard to embed in a product. You need the right guardrails around that. Prompt engineering, it's a slightly different way of working with models, which again is pushing the limits on MLOps frameworks. Agent orchestration, I think everyone's talking about agentic AI and these agentic systems right now. Very, very tough to actually get working in production. And finally, this kind of feedback loop is very different with Gen AI. So for the sake of time, I'll just kind of leave that up there. I think that's a topic we'll have to revisit next year, but I think it's something to keep an eye on. So maturity is going to change organization to organization, no matter where you are in the pipeline. Hopefully this slide's not offensive. OpenAI had a real good one on maturity there. But no matter where you are, I think these concepts, right, are the same. Don't boil the ocean. Use this bridge, right, getting away from innovation or getting from innovation actually into production and getting away from just the research project. Making sure you have business or user adoption. Starting with that thin slice as we discussed, thinking about the team in general, and then the governance component. We have a bunch of content out on our website. If you'd like to kind of drill into that, we'd be happy to. I'm sorry, was someone looking at the QR code? Takes us to the website there. And always happy to have a follow-up discussion. We have a professional services team that does this a lot. One of my colleagues, Dylan, is actually a real expert in MLOps and, goes into companies of all different sizes and types and does an MLOps assessment, helps them improve from no matter what maturity level they're at. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer what you have today, but also don't hesitate to kind of follow up with us.